Good evening. My name is Luke Lonergan.
And I'm Jordan Ojeda. This evening we'll be addressing the importance of media coverage related to the ISIS crisis.
More specifically, we will be focusing our analysis on the Canadian network CBC and the American media network CNN as they inform their respective audiences of the events taking place in Syria and Iraq.
Irving Goffman explains in his essay, Frame Analysis, an essay on the organization of experience, that the framing concept is the way a communication source defines and constructs any piece of communicated information. Framing is an unavoidable part of human communication. We all bring our own frames to our own communications.
We are aware that both the CBC and the CNN networks frame their content in specific ways as they report the news. Throughout our analysis, we'll be addressing the different ways that the stories are framed so that the audience can get a clear picture of how the media portrays information regarding ISIS. On November 7th, CNN aired a short broadcast addressing President Barack Obama's decision to send 1,500 more troops to Iraq to combat ISIS. The images in the broadcast are a compilation of combat and training scenes and the president speaking about the new plans. It shows U.S. soldiers shooting, riding in tanks, weapons firing, maps of where the combat is taking place, and where the soldiers are being sent. The images serve to show the strength of the U.S. forces and the resolve that the U.S. has to take care of business in Iraq. There are no images that portray the U.S. as weak or lacking in strength in any way. The message that comes across is that the President and the Army are successfully addressing the problems in Iraq. There are two aspects where the U.S. seems unclear: the finances involved and how many troops we should actually send to Iraq. The question is not whether we should be involved or not. The question is, where will we get funding to fight against ISIS? However, Congress is prepared to spend the money to send troops and to use U.S. military weapons in Iraq if they hear a good explanation for what will be accomplished by that spending.
Out of the videos that we have analyzed in this report, this is the most stereotypical American news broadcast. The compilation of training footage and weapons detonating alongside the president's reassuring statements go a long way to put the audience at ease. There are some hard facts, but they are very surface-level facts. The political officials who are shown don't go into much detail. They defer to other groups when asked about specifics regarding the war against ISIS. CNN frames this topic by directing our attention to the fact that this war is costly, but the broadcast goes one step further to reassure the American public that the president is taking care of things, and Congress is going to pay whatever price necessary to resist ISIS.
The CBC conducted an interview with Canadian General Tom Lawson regarding Canada's specific strategy against ISIS in Iraq. The reporter for CBC asked General Lawson direct questions about where the military would be focusing their efforts and what their objectives would be. He also questions the rationale behind these decisions. The Canadian officer continues addressing each question, reassuring the nation that they're taking care of business and that Canada is doing its part to eliminate each threat that it sees. This was a simple, no-nonsense interview aiming to inform the Canadian public with information directly from the source. Some of the questions had distinctly political biases, which the general either answers or tactfully avoids.
During several of the questions, the interviewer asked the general to compare Canada's mission to America's mission. General Lawson strategically explains Canada's strategy while avoiding making comments about any other country's strategy. General Lawson gives many general examples of how his military is resisting ISIS while leaving out specifics that the interviewer obviously wanted to hear. By conducting and airing this live interview, CBC shows that they are willing to pressure the political figures and military leaders because they want to air real answers without fluff or hype. In order to bring the interview to life, video clips of the actual war are showed to the side of the general while he explains that the Canadian military is making progress in whatever it is that they're attempting to do. On November 18, 2014, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, or CBC, released a news report dedicated to a new beheading video released by the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. This news report was delivered as strictly informational, and the main focus on this video was to show that these beheadings of a dozen Syrian military pilots were performed by unmasked ISIS members, while also explaining that military groups around the world were hard at work to identify the murderers. The CBC video showed video clips of French and Britain authorities quickly identifying two of the unmasked murderers as Nasa Hassana and Mateen Hushar. CBC then points out the dramatic differences between these beheading videos in comparison to the 4 others that were released earlier in the year. What's interesting in this informational video is that CBC quickly adds a side comment stating that there are no indications that any of them, the murderers, are from Canada. Other than the beheadings of the Syrian military pilots, there was also a beheading of a single American shown on camera, the beheading of Peter Kassing.
Why did CBC mention that there are no indications that any of the murderers are from Canada? A viewer might assume that they are just saying that these murders weren't performed by an American, but Canada's message was much more than that. By quickly suggesting this information in their news report, Canada is explaining that no one from their country, or their country in general, is associated with ISIS. By giving out this information, they're explaining and want everyone to believe that they are the good guys and that they want nothing to do with war. Even though half of this 16-minute video of these beheadings is dedicated to a single ISIS member's execution of American Peter Kassing, CBC only mentions Kassing's name once. CBC disregarded the first half of the video dedicated to Kassing's beheading because he wasn't a Canadian. If a Canadian had been beheaded, then they would have dedicated more of their news report to his death. Canada chose not to show Kassing's executioner making a threat towards Barack Obama because it had nothing to do with Canada. If the executioner had sent a threat to Canada, then they would air it because it would directly affect them in a negative way. The cable news network, CNN, released a similar news report that was focused on the same exact 16-minute execution video performed by ISIS members. However, the report on this video was drastically different. The CNN video opens with the brutal beheadings of Peter Kassing. They start with a montage of footage and pictures of Kassing, giving his background as a former U.S. soldier who recently started working as an aid worker in the Middle East. Following the clips of Kassing's life and death is a short clip of the unmasked men beheading several Syrian pilots. Then, CNN shows the footage of Kassing's apparent executioner making a serious threat to American President Barack Obama, stating that he needs to send U.S. ground troops to fight. Finally, to wrap up the video, Chuck Hagel, Defense Secretary of the United States, is showed giving a press conference ensuring those who are watching that we are not sending ground troops to Syria.
There is a need in this media analysis of the beheadings to highlight fallen American Peter Kassing's life. A good solid minute of this beheading analysis video is dedicated to Peter Kassing, unlike CBC's video. This dedication is shown in America's CNN network because Peter Kassing is an American. When Americans watch CNN or any other network broadcast, we want to know what is happening to our people across seas. Since the threat to send ground troops were dedicated to America and Obama, that is why it was aired. We want to know what is going on in the world and if it affects us. If Americans would have found out that CNN had left out this important threat like Canada did, Americans would be furious. We want to know what is going on in the world and if it affects us. If Americans would have found out that CNN had left out this important threat like Canada did, Americans would be furious. We don't want to be left in the dark. Why did CNN show a clip of Chuck Hagel announcing that we would not, at any circumstance, be sending ground troops to Syria? They did this to calm down Americans and ensure them that we were taking orders from these executioners and that we weren't going to take any type of action against this. They wanted to calm Americans down and prevent a countrywide panic. Canada didn't show Chuck Hagel stating this because they had nothing to do with the threat.
If foreign correspondents do face greater limitations, and if the consequence is that foreign news takes its lead from domestic news, then there would seem to be at least one other potentially important implication for foreign news content. To be clear, domestic journalists would play an important role in defining the focus and likely the tone of coverage for foreign journalists. This is perhaps as it should be. Those most familiar with domestic news are able to play an important role in establishing the focus and tone of coverage.
While covering the activity of ISIS, international networks show a much more general view of the situation, while local networks, such as Al Jazeera, are able to focus on the raw, intimate specifics. International networks such as CNN and CBC focus on the overarching themes of this conflict. These networks have, however, become more involved when their own reporters have entered the conflict and became part of the story. In America and Canada, we care about the conflict more because we are directly involved now that they have captured and killed our own citizen. It's become personal. An article written by Al Jazeera, a non-biased media network located in Qatar that focuses on relaying global media truthfully, wrote an article on the violent actions taking place in Syria performed by ISIS members. Those who wrote this article witnessed the violent acts themselves, and their reactions are pure. Those who are living there witnessed massacres, beheading boys, amputations, and lashings in public squares that residents were forced to watch, stoning women to death for suspected adultery, and holding women as sexual slaves and forcing them to bear children for their fighters. The article then explains that 300 people fled the area that were in ISIS control. This article is important because it was written by people who are living in Syria who are writing about problems that are happening in Syria. These aren't news stories that are passed from ear to ear across oceans that will be relayed on media networks for the world to see. On CNN, CBC, or other media networks, you don't hear as much detail about the abuse and violence happening to those who live in Syria. This article gives a first-hand view on the hate crimes and viciousness performed by ISIS members on innocent people. After analyzing these particular reports, we would like to reiterate that CNN and CBC are covering the same content in different ways. The two media companies are representing different countries with different interests and values.
The Canadian and American governments are addressing the conflict with ISIS with different strategies. CBC is highlighting events and stories that directly impact Canadians. CNN is highlighting events and stories that directly impact Americans.
CBC is producing media that addresses tough questions that are on the minds of the Canadian public.
Canadians are demanding more straightforward answers, and CBC is willing to do what it takes to get those answers from its government and military leaders to their audience.
It seems that CNN can get by with reporting a more general overview of U.S. interactions with ISIS because their reports merely assure the public that the problems are being taken care of without proving hard, detailed evidence.
It's clear that this is an issue that can't be overlooked. It's important that we are aware of these framing strategies so that we can be well-informed citizens who think critically about the media that we consume every day.
It's been a pleasure serving you, and we hope you enjoyed our broadcast.
Good night.